Hi everybody, welcome to our Carcanet book launch tonight. My name is Jasmine, I'm from Carcanet Press. We are here to launch John Gallas's new collection, the Extasie. Of course, we're joined by John, he's here with us tonight, and we're also joined by Robyn Marsack, the editor and translator. She's also a long-time friend of Carcanet, so it's really nice to have her here hosting this reading for us this evening. Before I invite Robyn on screen, just quickly going to run over what's going to happen tonight. So we'll be here for about an hour, I think. We can't see you, unfortunately, you can't turn your cameras on, so please do find the chat box and say hello to us and get involved. Let us know what you think of the reading. John is going to read for us, and while he's reading, I'm going to have the text on screen for you to make it a bit easier to follow along. Just do be aware that you're in control of your own screen, so if you need to see the text bigger or smaller, or you want to switch between his video and the text, just have a play around with your own screen. After the readings, Robyn and John will have some conversation about the new book, and we'd really like you to get involved at that stage. We're going to have a Q&A, so if you could also find the Q&A button somewhere on the bottom of your screen and get some questions lined up that Robyn can put to John later on in the evening, that would be really, really great. So I think that's everything from me for now. I'm going to invite Robyn on screen to join me.
Hello everybody, and I'm really delighted to be here to be hosting the launch of John's latest book, The Extasies, not least because we're fellow New Zealanders. We've both lived in the UK for decades and haven't lost our accents. You will notice from that shot of the book cover that the spin-off, which is New Zealand's very good political and cultural online weekly, has described John as the greatest New Zealand poet no one has ever heard of. And I hope after this book, more people will have heard of him. You can discover other lovely New Zealand poets, great New Zealand poets, on Carcanet's list. Don't all rush to the chat to tell us who they are. Now, John went to Oxford a few years actually in advance of me, and I joined Carcanet as an editor a few years in advance of his joining as a poet. Carcanet's published 12 of his collections now, but that represents a mere half of his poetry publications. The first of the Carcanet books being Practical Anarchy in 1989. That title gives an indication of his mindset, I think. The second one, Flying Carpets Over Filbert Street, suggests that restless, curious traveller that he became. And he brought the world to Carcanet in the form of the Song Atlas. Wonderful book. Came out in 2002 with poems from 196 nations, transcribed, translated, reversioned by John. It's a cornucopia of an anthology, something to savour. The Extasie, though, is rooted in Lincolnshire and Norfolk. It's a reflection on love through the seasons. It's a hallelujah to the finding of love and to being found by love. And I'd call it, excuse the pun, a state of the heart collection. I hope that hearing from John will really send you rushing to read it. So I'm going to hand over to John now for him to read some poems. Then I'm going to ask him some questions. And as Jazz has said, we'll open it out to you through the Q&A button. So over to John now.
Hello. Thank you, Robyn. It's John here. I'm going to read 9 poems from the collection. They don't need any introduction because the poems are all about the same subject. And I will start with The Air Between, which is a poem about a kind of separation that doesn't exist, because for this particular kind of love, there is no such thing as separation. And this poem attempts to describe perhaps even the scientific reason why this kind of love doesn't have what it says that it does. The air between. Sometimes we part perforce. I drive away to some unlovely lot, some fallow land that isn't you, and you to nod for no man's land, and all the air between. I stop at Prickwillow. From here to you is just 100 miles. The little lark laps slow as Sunday, all the world to round again. I eat an apple in the dark and rattle on. Faster than the lick of light, the bottoms say, the universe expands, and I believe them. Ah, love, I feel it now, tonight. They know. At Shingle Street, exhilaration warps above the sea. And so, you see, by relativity, we approach each other while we part. Impetuous, inevitable, like small, sweet moons upon the backs of worlds, which we, to each other, are. The second poem is called Once We Stammered, and is a relation of a true event that happened to me several years ago on the tube in London, when a young man who was looking rather weirdly fidgety in the carriage suddenly stood up and pronounced what he says in this poem, which is called Once We Stammered. Barreling through Baron's Court, I bit the corners of my path and slyly stared around at the comely buttes. Bouncing thus in this fair company, I saw him smile, I saw him rise, I saw the glory in his eyes, who said, weep for Adonais, he is dead, Charlie is me darling, nymphs and shepherds come away, I was cured of my stammer today. Wow. We freighter folk rattled under Hammersmith, and someone cried amen, and some said yes, and some said bless, and some were dumb but shone. And then he sat down again. And silent, I said, ample make this bed. Now yez are in the Willingdone Musy Room, far from the madding crowd's ignoble strife. So, love, you have cured me of the stammer of my life. The third poem is called Lines on a Bike. It's a poem that represents an ongoing, interesting, not exactly a problem, but an ongoing thing that happens to me in my writing, because I spend what seems to amount like half of my life riding my bicycle around Lincolnshire and Norfolk. I quite often have a poem beginning to form with the rhythm of the pedals, and as I go along, look at the landscape around me. And of course, it then becomes a problem when one finds a really good line or a really good phrase to remember this. I've tried taking those little notebooks with pencils that go down the side. I even once took a miniature dictaphone, but it doesn't work. You just have to run with it and bear it. So this one is about pedaling on at a long distance from home and trying to remember a poem which is coming as I ride. Lines on a Bike. I found a poem in my brain. Its knotty line was you. Precious, therefore, I tried to keep it safe with repetition, peddling it to permanence, come hill, come bunt, come hours that die, and blanch invention out. Comes the bastard hill anon, comes the bastard rain, and then a scary rattle down, which while I chanted off our sentence yet at 40 miles an hour, a bounce and slap, but keeping still, quite still, that gimbaled bowl of level sense wherein they all might pause. Comes the happy end eventual, and comes the happy borrow. And so this came, exact, whose perfect faults daunt me not, who carried it still harping in his scully ark, not loose to luck or loveliness, whose coupled words have reached forgiven land and live, and which I could not bear to change, like you. Comes the sweet worm ideal, comes sweet incorruption, so. The next poem is called, rather alarmingly, B.L. Edgerton 2711, Sir Thomas Wyatt's poem book, and is a short poem that was written after viewing in the British Library the manuscript B.L. Edgerton 2711, which is in fact Sir Thomas Wyatt's poem book, which lay open in behind the glass and very brightly lit in an exhibition. I'm very fond of Wyatt in selection. He seems to me to be somebody who expresses a love poem with both passion and realism. And here's a poem that reflects perhaps my admiration for him and what he did, and also our little kinship when we were both writing about more or less the same thing. B.L. Edgerton 2711, Sir Thomas Wyatt's poem book. If I understand your dapper hand, you pine for love. Though nothing new, it's woven well. I lean and look. My fever here I see, shuttled back to me from the loom thread of your book. I leave on the looking glass a butter film reflected of my brother brow. Tonight, in the lowered library light, we will spin a tale upon a sigh, Sir Thomas and I. The next poem is called The Soupy Sheep, and it's called The Soupy Sheep because I met the sheep and I was reading a book about Sufism at the same time. The beginning is rather curious. It occurred somewhere near Alexton in Rutland, where I go walking quite often, and I saw this sheep. And being in New Zealand, I love sheep, especially their very long, bony snouts. So I sat myself down right beside the fence, and the sheep came up and stared at me for ages and ages and ages with a very intense look, but rather kind, rather sad. So this is called The Soupy Sheep. Here comes the sheep to see the curious length of twisted ease inside her fence, who looks at me across her big bone bridge of snout, so long and still. I ask, what do you think of me? I think of love, she says. Her bug-wet eyeballs wander on to all the thorns and nettles, hot and sad, beside the road. Everything, she says, wrapped beyond her popgun droppings, makes me think of love. Other sheep sleep, fubsy stale, as if on stairs up the shaven hill. The next poem is, I suppose, a little bit John Clarish, and it's called The Heart's Eve. I'm very fond of John Clare. Mainly, this is purely a personal view, because I enjoy the poems which cannot be critically analysed, which aren't about anything, they just are. When John Clare describes in intimate detail a bird's nest, I can't find anything else, and I don't want anything else. And this is a poem about trying not to have anything else. The Heart's Ease. Jesus Christ, I'm sitting on a weed in Bedlam Field, staring at a heart's ease in a slub under a muffled drum of clouds. Ha! I am not mad, John, or not despised, rejected, oh, contrariwise, I am too much in love. And so I sit with Johnny Jumper in the dark. I roundly wipe my glasses and lean more close to this dear, honest plant, whose flowerless braid of winter greens dangles in a ring of thorns. The criss-cross stem is bowed and pale from thirsty tire. The hearty leaves in glossy slump waggle, wet in the wind, their tiny, bickered teeth. Which is enough of that. My pants are plashed, my fingers pricked, but I have done my duty. See, the cloud rolls slowly now upon a cylinder of light. I take too long on you. I only thought to balance back the world by paying it some wholly rapt attention, which I have done. Now, the next poem is rather near to the lunatic fringe. I have a lunatic fringe opinion of a couple of things in life. And the love, as described in this book, is certainly one of them. The collision of two fated souls, and the strange supernatural scientific inevitability of what happens. It's a very unusual kind of love, but it's absolutely and utterly undeniable. And the event in this poem is one of two in my life that actually happened and is beyond comprehension and beyond belief and is supernatural and yet completely and utterly undeniable. If Robyn may be kind enough later to ask me what the other one is, it was a New Zealand experience, perhaps even more alarming and amazing. I was peddling into a place called Newton in the Isle, which is quite near Tid St Giles in Lincolnshire in February. It was cold, it was just getting dark. And the little village signs in England, or even the town signs in England, which are those reflective white oblong signs with the black lettering and are made to reflect headlights of passing traffic and cars. I came towards it on my bike, and it bloomed into this astonishing light. There was no car behind me, no car in front of me, no moon, and I didn't have my bike lights on. And this is my explanation. Newton in the aisle. At 4 o'clock, the February sky let loose a sudden smatch and shower like salt, shook once across the victuals of the land I pedalled past from Tid. The sun lay low on Fitton End, and all the watersides, and blinked behind the shortening waft of white. Newton next, the flooded fields like metal trays, and nothing rode the road but I. The village sign, 6 black characters in transport type on silver sheeting, softly burst in blooms of light back in my face with all the quiet clamour of a cloud. A moment then it blossomed. Then I passed. Why invent the truth? My eyes are headlights, dynamoed with fierce content, that spill some radiance, that wakes the retro-reflect fire in everything. I pedalled down the darkling street elate, past the prettier sign on which Sir John and Mary in the Marsh, the dull white lion rampant, 6 hushed bells and a weed of woad are painted and sawn out on a pole. Whose particular and huddled history, to me, was a mere dark age beside the common guide, like a February island laid in a sea of dazzle, seasoned with rain. The next poem is, like all of them, also true, and is about the bearded angels of North Creek Church. North Creek Church is a very, very large church in a very, very small village, a few miles behind Cromer. I've passed through it a few times. And if you go into the church, right up in the hammer beam roof, there are a wonderful series of wooden carved angels, some playing musical instruments, some with beards, and all of them just fascinating and realistic. And the real clincher is that when you go in, there is lying just inside the door a very large tray with a mirror in it. And you can walk up and down the aisle, and without straining your neck, you can view the bearded angels of the church up high by looking down rather than up. The bearded angels of North Creek Church. You're in the English elongated style, late and horizontal, like these, lean, wood white, and leaning down from the creaking hammer roof. There's a wind outside where the new daffodils slap, but here, in quietness, I walk the aisle, holding a mirror like a tray of light. And looking in, they pass above. Some with music, some with beards, watching in this high dark shell, the hushed procession of my bones. I stop. The windows rattle, then return, steady as a waiter. I put the mirror back. Cold wind shakes the door, and I leave this wooden heaven for a skimble of trees. Inside, the mirror develops in its silver plate and pool a picture of my passing. The angels sharpening and still, inclining me in your fashion to endure. And lastly, a poem that would be bizarre if the nature of the two half souls theory of love wasn't in itself bizarre. This is also, as I said before, like all the events here, quite true. I dreamt very vividly one night of the sandals of Mr. T. Lawrence of Arabia. And the next morning got in my car and drove to Oxford, which is no small distance, to see them in the Ashmolean, where they are in a large Perspex case. Don't ask me why. Don't ask me why I dreamed of them. But I did, and I went, and I considered the nature of mystery to do with the dream and to do with the love that may have caused the mystery, or may not. I suppose then it's another poem that tries to depict and explain and celebrate the makings of that kind of supernatural love affair, which seems to the person in it quite normal. The Sandals of T.E. Lawrence. A wormy dream time bade me rise and go. I rose and went. Sure enough, there they were, the sandals of Mr. Lawrence, slap flat on the fuzzy floor of an acrylic wardrobe, dusted as Windle's straw. I glided forth and hooked on my Fendies. Ha! Just what I saw in my sleep. A hammock for the heel, a strap for the dorsum, a thong for the halluxian interstice. The foot, of course, dead as a mummy. Small blue and yellow quadratures decorate the wider leatherings, or did I imagine that? I can't remember. I hurried home, thrice comforted. That night, co-sinuous as spoons, we dropped off together, and I did not think of the mysteries of the world. Let them be mysteries, and make us smile. Unshake the ship, and close your eyes. We'll sail into the fond moonshine, and I will hold your feet on mine. You will do for all that means to me. Sleep now, and let us see what we shall see. Thank you very much.
John, that was wonderful to hear. Thank you so much for that. And I can see from the messages in the chat that people have been enjoying them as much as I have. And there are questions coming up too, but I'm going to start with a couple of my own, if I may.
Okay.
The title of your collection, The Extasie. So the title and its spelling, of course, direct us to John Donne's poem of that title, with its two motionless figures on a bank, two motionless lovers, both inhabiting their bodies, but also seeing their souls colliding or relating in the air. And you've said that there are plenty of thank yous to the love masters, Dunn and Wyatt, in these poems. So can you tell us a bit about what you feel you owe to them, either in spirit, because you said a little bit about the Wyatt, or in form and shape in particular? Wyatt and Dunn.
Certainly. Yes, I think there are probably three, Dunn and Wyatt, and certainly they're one because of the title and the very obvious influences, I think. Wyatt, because he's actually one of the poems, and John Clare also.
Yes.
And shall I explain all three, perhaps?
Yes,
would that be sensible?
Yes, sure.
Let's start with John Clare, because he's probably the most, or the least, what would we say, pokey out. He's in there without sort of putting himself anywhere. The very close observation of nature, the delight in the names of plants and the names of places and the names of things and the names of animals and the names of your surroundings. I hope I've evolved from him into that. I also like the fact that John Clare, as I said, it seems quite sometimes to me anyway, and not to an academic, I do accept this, to write poems which are just beautifully written and observed poems. And meaning is secondary if meaning is intended at all beyond the description. Wyatt is somebody who I've laboured quite long on, and I have tried and tried and tried, but I do find that severe selection is what appeals to me. And but there are 6 or 7 or 8 absolutely perfectly beautiful, mostly love poems, which I admire tremendously. I think the combination of, as I said before that poem, of a kind of distraughtness at the same time as profundity, a kind of a recklessness and almost daring, both in form and feeling, and yet that sort of a terrible longing to not be disturbed. And I find also that that's the time, and I think that extends to Dunn as well, when English seemed to me to be at its most, what's the word? Well, there were lots of words. And I think Shakespeare and Dunn and Wyatt make the most of that. The vocabulary and what was available to be used in a poem or a piece of writing seemed to me to be tremendously rich and various, and was used by, obviously, all three of them to their utmost. Which brings us to Dunn. There's absolutely no doubt in my mind that Dunn is my favourite poet. It's a very difficult thing to say because people like poems rather than poets, and Dunn wrote some plonkers as well as the splendid ones that he did. But I think there is nobody who can be represented with such a large variety of absolutely perfectly beautiful poems. There are many, 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 many of them, and I like the same things as I like about Wyatt. That kind of richness of language, but what's added in Dunn, and which I hope has some little threads that come out in the Extasie as well, is that astonishing facility with language, that astonishing freedom of feeling, an equally astonishing discipline of thought, intellectual ideas and thinking, which branches into science, and a lot of the poems in the Extasie are to do with science. There's a Darwin poem, there's a black hole poem, there's a Two Halves of the Soul poem, all of which are trying to account for this fact that a love that's made of the collision of two half souls that have searched for each other, but inevitably found each other, is not a kind of love that is the one that, we went through some ups and downs, but we're still here. It's of a completely different, not better, just different quality. And the book, in a way, seeks to explain what that is. And it seems to me that Dunn's got that. The language, the feeling, the thought, and of course the salty sprinkling of wit are all at their utmost perfection and also in the perfection of balance. And it's that perfect combination of things which makes Me Love Done more than anyone else. And that's going to show through whether I'm trying to show it or not. Some of the things in the Extasie are fairly obvious, but it runs through most of the poems in some form or other, conscious or unconscious on my part.
I think this book is a huge tribute to Donne. You know, I think it is. It comes through wonderfully, and one of the things two of the things that strike me about the book, the unusualness of the love or the way you choose to describe the love that's portrayed in this book. And it's not only that the intellect is in as full a play as the feeling, if we're going to divide things in that way, which is, I think, quite unusual in contemporary poetry. So that's one thing that marks it out. But also the way that you have chosen to embody the love in landscapes. And also, of course, in that church with the angels, but it lives in the land, and that seems to me a great achievement of the book and really wonderful. But allied to that feeling about the landscape, I think, is the language that you choose. So when you say that Donne, and Wyatt to some extent, but Donne particularly, is so fertile in the use of vocabulary and doesn't try to pare back words, but relishes all the different kinds of coinages. You make coinages yourself, and could you just talk a bit about choosing your words? It is very noticeable, your habit of doing all sorts of things with words. I had a dictionary beside me, I have to say, when I was reading it, and I wondered whether you thought, I mean, I didn't know what a gimbal was, for example, and I didn't know what dioptric meant, or the moon librating. So this was all new to me, and I think partly because it's scientific vocabulary that it brings something that's outside my experience. But do you think about the readers when you're writing? Do you think, oh well, this will stretch them a bit, or does it come very naturally to you?
It did come naturally. I think the whole movement onto that or into that plane or that area came because of the nature of what happened. I didn't want to spend the book describing Mikey's nose, or his fingers, or his, the look of his eyes, or something like that. I wanted to try and analyze, describe, celebrate what actually happened, because it is supernatural, but it is undeniable. And I think what happens there, to get back to your question about language, I think what happens is that you then move into something a little bit different. I've never written poetry like this before. And I think, if we take the bicycle analogy, I think if you bicycle and walk, then place names, the landscape itself becomes something which is described in fact. For instance, if you cycle up a really steep hill and you get to the top and you suddenly think, you see a sign that says this is called Cow Climb or something like that, you think, well, yeah, it's called Cow Climb because I've just done it. Whereas if you go in a car or my van or something like that, this doesn't matter. And it's this slowing down to look at things intently that allows the feeling that I have in, and it comes in and it covers the landscape, and therefore it needs describing in great detail. You can't say general what would you call it, just love things. You can't do that. You've got to try and put it in some sort of context of science, as I said, landscape, the supernatural world, because it is something, it can be so easily thought of as being quite mad in a funny sort of way, that this is something that just doesn't happen. And we need to be able to explain it, sort of rationally. And really, only this happened or only that happened. But believe me, it didn't. This actually did happen. The attempt to use certain types of language, which are different from what I usually have used, is down to the fact that I'm trying to account for, as well as describe, something so extraordinary that it required extraordinary and at the same time very realistic language. So I think perhaps the richness, if there is a Dunnish type of richness, comes from that combination of wanting to be realistic, because Dun is in many ways very, very realistic, along with something vast. And that combination is quite difficult to do. But once you get going, it sort of sticks. You have mentioned one or two times to me that the books that I've written have quite often been books that are thematic, that are bounded in some way and exist within themselves. They're not a collection of single poems that I've written. They all have a sort of a theme. I've done 8 sins. I've done things that are collections of tankers, things that are collections of sonnets, things that are about a certain subject. And they're usually blocked in rather than that. And so I've tried very hard to do that as well, because the experience is one that needs describing to be understood in great detail, as well as containing the passion and the excitement that is in it. So that's probably nothing to do with your question, but that's the way it was.
Not right, but it will do very well, because it also takes in that idea that I feel that it was thought of as a complete thing in itself, maybe from the beginning. I mean, you've got 62 poems here. I mean, did you set out to write a certain number, or but you conceived it nevertheless as a whole? And I'm wondering also about your writing methods, because there's an absolutely great blog to which I would refer everybody that you did for the Rylands about creation. Jazz has just put up the connection there in the chat. That's just a fascinating blog that you did when you deposited your notebooks in the Rylands and you talked about your writing method. And one of the things you said is, normally it's absolute agony, and I sit there surrounded, I'm paraphrasing, sit there surrounded with rhyming dictionaries and thesaurus and so forth and so on, and I'm doing lots of different kinds of versions. And I wondered whether that writing process of sitting there with the rhyming dictionaries and so forth is something that was not the same for this, therefore, that you were out biking, that you were composing in your head, and then when you got back, you had the happy biro, and you were able to go ahead and do that, or whether it was more like your usual way of doing things with a lot of aid.
Unfortunately, it came down in the end to the usual, and I do have 2 rhyming dictionaries, several thesauruses, dictionaries of slang, Fowler, various things about idioms and phrases and things like that. Because it seems to me that, and this is the other lunatic fringe of my my sort of way of writing, and I think I said it in the Rylands thing as well, that it seems to be undeniable in some way that the poem that you're fighting for and trying to get perfect is, I'm sorry to say this, already there. And it's almost like cleaning a window in order to get through to the perfect thing. I mean, otherwise, how else would you know that you're unhappy with that just that single word. So the poem is fine, but you go to bed and you think, oh no, I have to get up, that word's not right. And you do, and you get up and you search through everything. And I think the fact that there's something like Rosa's Thesaurus or a reference book to use is simply that you can find in there that word that you suddenly think, that's it, that's it.
Mm-hmm.
And I may not even have not exactly known it, but it might not have ever been part of my conscious knowledge that I had that word, but I know it was right when it happens. So whatever people think of these poems, the idea that some sort of perfection is there, which is form and language and thought and feeling and all those things, is what I am striving towards getting, because I do believe somehow you know when you've got it right. And how else would you know that you've got it right unless in some form it was sort of already there for you to fill in or make clear or get the bits in the right place. And then suddenly you think, that's it, I've got it. And you usually don't change it after that. Now, these poems are different insofar that, yes, many of them did come while walking, while cycling, and while driving. And the happy biro did arrive, usually in the caravan after I'd been cycling. But still, that last bit of getting exactly everything in place does, I'm afraid, still with me require the reference books scattered around me. Everything from an atlas to there's a wonderful rhyming dictionary that apparently Byron used to use, which begins backwards. You look up the last letter and then the letter before and then the letter before, and that gives you everything. So that's the sort of thing. I mean, I quite enjoy it as well. But yes, absolutely necessary. I can't believe that I have ever written a poem, except I once wrote a poem on the train between Dublin and Belfast, which I was happy with, which had no reference book at all. But honestly, I think that's probably the only one.
Well, I shall ask you later to identify that for me. But we've got some really interesting questions here, John, and
okay.
A couple of them connect with just what you've been saying. So Derek, and actually Michael also pointed this out, Derek says, I noticed that at times the word you read differed from the text on the screen. For example, wordworm became poem, and boyos became characters. And so Derek asks, would you subscribe to the idea that poems are never finished, merely abandoned, or are in some ways unstable? But what you've just been saying about the perfect poem and finishing seems to suggest you don't have that idea.
Yeah, they're bloody finished. They're finished. It was a long, hard struggle, and I think I've done myself what I wanted to do in that one. Interestingly enough, the characters in boyos was something that I never ever solved. So I'm quite happy in a way that they both exist in a way, because I could never choose between the two. For the reader, the word characters is much better because it's the letters of Newton written on the village sign. But Six Black Boyos is so much better. But of course, it doesn't really. Sometimes that might send a reader, somewhere else. Really, it's not quite as well thing. So I'm actually quite happy with that. The other one was probably a mistake in my reading. But yes, the boyos of the characters one is certainly something that still, I could toss up on either side, and depending on where I wanted to put it.
Thank you. And Kate had asked about the cycling and the biking, whether you could feel the rhythm of that in the finished poems. Do you think it's different to poems that come in other ways? So does the motion that you have when you're thinking the poems first influence the final form of them?
I think there are two halves to that. I think that the rhythm does engender sort of a kind of poem, but I don't think in the end they are different in kind from a poem that I would normally write. To me, the cycling is that element that I've described before of slowing down and being a part of the landscape. I mean, I go to the caravan 2 to 3 days every single week. So I spend almost half my life on my bicycle floor walking around these places. And yes, it does engender by where you are and what you're doing, ideas of poetry. And yes, I think the rhythm in some way does come through as well. But I don't think in the end that produces a poem which is actually manifestly different from the sort of thing I would write if I sat at my desk. Usually my poems begin out somewhere and are polished off, as it were, with the reference books around me at the desk. That's usually the process by which it's done.
And could I ask you, that reminds me that you have expressed a thought about in the Rylands blog. You call to what you make a reference to what you call binding agents in poems, and which differentiate poetry from prose. And is rhythm one of those binding agents that you consider for poetry?
Yes. I mean, again, this is another quite personal thing. I mean, Seamus Heaney's written poems that are prose chopped up into lines, and they work fabulously well. And some of them actually possibly don't have binding agents of any sort. But alliteration, assonance, rhyme is another matter. I would quite like to sort of talk about rhyme if there's time. But the Old English and rhyming. Sorry, the Old English alliteration and assonance is something that's very powerful and which I use a lot as a binding agent to make it different from prose. Arabic classical literature also has rhyme within the prose, which is a fabulous sort of idea that it makes it just that little bit more artificial, which pokes the writer a bit more into the consciousness of the reader, rather than just reading something which could be by anybody. You think, there's a rhyme actually within a piece of prose. That's interesting. What on earth are they doing, and why? And that's that little pause, that little slowing down to bicycle speed instead of reading it car speed. That I really admire and which I try to reproduce in some way or other. I've forgotten the question.
It was about the binding elements, and you've answered it.
Yes.
There's another question here from Adam, and he says, if I may, John, it's not unreasonable to say that your previous Carcanet book, The Little Sublime Comedy, is one of the best things anybody's ever written. He says, Adam.
Blimey, who's this person?
Adam Crothers, another
Thank you, Adam.
poet. Yeah. And it's full of subtlety and intimacy, but all happening on a huge scale with high stakes. How do long-form narrative projects such as that inform and inflect these similarly splendid but smaller scale, or at any rate far shorter poems? So what's the relationship between those? And you've got about 3 minutes to answer that.
Okay. Well, The Little Sublime Comedy was a real, I read Dante. I like Dante, but I'm not a sort of a Dante, what's the word, either aficionado or scholar or wild enthusiast, which is strange. I mean, it's a little bit like Wagner. I listen to Wagner. I quite like Wagner. And usually most people either hate him or love him. But I like him. He's good. And I feel the same about Dante. And I thought, as I read through the Dante, that there was so much to do with medieval politics and the Christian punishment system that I suddenly thought, I think quite differently about all these elements. And I would really like to do one where somebody is plucked from a mountaintop in New Zealand while tramping and taken through a 21st century hell, purgatory, and heaven. So it's a poem which is both vast, but I hope also has that sort of realistic comic element, which I love so much in things like Tristram Shandy and Tom Jones, and it may be untypical, but in my beloved Samuel Beckett, who makes me far from miserable, in fact, who makes me laugh so much that I've often fallen off several chairs and sofas while reading him. And the start, pause, and stop in the Extasie at the beginning, the end, and the middle are nicked from Kratz's tape, just as a tiny little tribute to somebody I love who I couldn't get an influence in any other way.
So I don't know whether that's quite answered Adam's question, but we are drawing to the end of our session, and I hope that John will feel that his question about influences and catalysts has been answered in the course of these other questions. So as we are coming to an end, John, I just wanted to throw one question at you, and that is, because I always love hearing what poets are reading. So I just thought I would ask you, what would you press into this audience's hands if you had the opportunity? What book, or an old favorite or a new one that interests you, that you would say, go away and read this?
3 weeks ago, I finished a book called Ali and Nino. That's ALI and NINO, which is a love story, which is the sort of national book of Azerbaijan, which I'd never heard of. And even more fascinatingly, it's by a very mysterious person who nobody knows who he is, who is called Kurban Saeed, who was either an imposter or somebody else, or may have been a society woman in a completely different country who made it all up, or may have been a native who was actually part of the wars that are described in this beautiful, beautiful love story. And what I love about it most is the fact that it has a very arrogant narrator. And I love that sort of slightly daring idea that you can write a book about passion and war and habits and customs which we know not of, it's all new, in the voice of a person who sort of sweeps through this novel with a bit of style and a bit of difference, instead of that strangeness. It always strikes me as interesting that I once sent something to an agent, I think it was, and they wrote back and said, I'm sorry, this sounds a little too much like Beckett. And I felt like writing back and saying, if I'd written it in plain ordinary prose, would you have sent it back and said, this sounds too much like Trollope? And it seems to me that, there are certain styles which are taken for granted as being the way in which you would write, especially prose. And I love the ones that don't do that. And this book certainly doesn't do that. It's completely wonderful. It's quite short. And I can't remember who publishes it, but it's very, very famous in its place. So it's very easy to get hold of as well. It's called Ali and Nino, and it's by Kurban Saeed.
Well, thank you so much, John. And that was totally unexpected. And that seems right for your poetry in general, that it takes a totally unexpected perspective on things and is hugely stimulating, amusing, and quite glorious, as one person said this evening. It is a glorious book that we have here in the Extasie, and thank you so much for reading to us and talking to us about it.
Thank you very much. I'm absolutely delighted to do it. I enjoyed the reading, loved the questions, and the whole experience was nowhere near as bizarre as I thought it might be. In fact, it seems quite normal. Thank you very much.
Thank you guys both so much. Thanks for your beautiful reading, John, and Robyn, thanks so much for sharing this discussion. It's been really, really fascinating to hear you talk about the poems, and especially about riding your bike. Really, really, really enjoyed it. Thank you. And thank you guys for being here. Please go and buy the book. You are entitled to £2 off, and I'm putting the link in the chat for you, and the code is there as well. You will get that as an email tomorrow, so just check your emails if you don't want to do it right now, and get in touch with me if you have any problems at all trying to access a copy of the book, and I can help you out. So the last thing I need to tell you is that on Wednesday evening we're launching a new collected poems by Ian Crichton Smith. We'll be joined by the editor, John Greening, and we're also going to be joined by a Blood Axe poet, Niall Campbell. So if you look at our website and join us this time next week, we'll be launching that. So again, thank you all for being here. Congratulations, John, on the publication of this new collection, and thank you, Robyn, for such a great evening. I will leave the chat open for a couple of minutes. You can get your last-minute messages in there, but I'm going to turn it all off now, and we'll say goodbye. So thanks.
Thank you very much, Jazz.
Yeah.